Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started shortly here. For those of you just joining, if you could take a second and please answer the Mentimeter survey question that's on your screen. That would be great to get us set up for today's crediting presentation. You can find the link to the Mentimeter survey in the chat.
Could you resend that Mentimeter link? I don't see it in my chat.
We'll let this go just for a few more seconds, maybe another minute. I see some things are popping in.
If you want, Dwayne, I can just leave this up while you give the kind of opening part of this.
That's fine. I encourage everybody to take advantage of this and provide your thoughts on what you believe the definition of stormwater crediting is. That would be awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dwayne Duncanson. I am the supervisor of the Municipal Stormwater Regulatory Program here at the MPCA. Welcome. Before we get going, just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Just to let you know, we do record these sessions so that we can post them on our stormwater events page in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual for viewing at a later time. Another thing is, we really like these to be as informal as possible. This is about a discussion. This is about having conversations, and this is about getting questions answered. And so we really encourage folks to feel free to click off your mute and ask questions. Certainly use the chat. Don't hesitate to do any of that stuff. So for those of you who have not yet attended one of our monthly outreach and Q&A sessions, we've been doing these since last October on the third Thursday of every month from 9 to 11 with the intent to do them through October of 2022. This will be our 9th session, and we have covered MS4 basics. We've covered each of the 6 minimum control measures so far. We've covered TMDLs, MS4 audits, and the agency's enforcement process. And today's session is about stormwater best management practice crediting. Our goal with these outreach and Q&A sessions is to assist any regulated MS4 out there or their representative, like consultants, with understanding the permit requirements, how to interpret them, and associated MPCA expectations in terms of compliance. Another main objective has been to highlight what has changed between the 2013 permit and the reissued 2020 permit to ensure municipal representatives are well equipped as they revise the local programs over the allotted 12-month period since being issued coverage to reflect those changes. Today's session is about best management practice crediting. We are aware and we know that there's been some confusion and uncertainty around this particular topic. So we wanted to devote a session to talking about what credits are and why BMP crediting is relevant to our management of stormwater. Hopefully today we can clarify things like how are credits developed? How are credits calculated? Do credits evolve over time? And why is calculating credits important as it relates to meeting MS4 permit goals and objectives? And before I turn this over, I just wanted to give a quick reminder to everybody on the call that annual reports are due June 30th of this year. So that's just a number of days away. But I just wanted to throw that reminder out there. End of business June 30th. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Mike Trojan, Anna Bosch, and Carly Cheldahl. Thanks.
Thanks, Dwayne. I believe I'm up, but certainly somebody can jump in and interrupt me if I'm not. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Is that okay,
Oh,
Carly?
1 second, Mike. We're going to do the introduction Mentimeter surveys, and then you can jump into your presentation.
Sorry about that.
No problem. All right, everybody. I did post the Mentimeter survey link into the chat, so if you can just go there and access that. If you have had a chance to answer our first question this morning, what's your definition of stormwater crediting? Thank you for doing that. I'm going to move on to the next question here. What organization are you representing today? All right, I'm going to give it another second here. Looks like majority of us on the call today are representing a city organization. All right, next question. How long have you been working with the MS4 permit? All right, I'll give it another second here for anybody who wants to answer yet. All righty, it looks like we have people from all different backgrounds and years of working with the MS4 permit. I think that's my last question this morning. Yep. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike and Anna. All right, Mike, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Carly. And sorry for the interruption. We had 3 internal meetings to talk about the format of this presentation. I suppose I should have been listening during those meetings, but anyways, so now I'm going to share screen. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about what a stormwater credit is. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I think it's important to get that information out there, and hopefully it coincides with what we're seeing in terms of folks understanding what a stormwater credit is. And then I'm going to go through an example with the MIDS calculator, and then I'll turn it over to Anna, and she'll go over the TMDL portion of the presentation. And I believe after I'm done, there'll be some Mentimeter questions that we'd like to gather some information about stormwater crediting. So what is a stormwater credit? Pretty much it's a difference between what goes in and what comes out of a best management practice. And that best management practice could be a rain garden, it could be street sweeping, something non-structural. So basically it is how much reduction in either volume or pollutant is being achieved by a particular stormwater management practice. And you can see in this particular schematic here that if we're infiltrating water, you get 100% credit for the pollutants. If it's being filtered and returned back to the stormwater system through an underdrain, you're getting 60%. Some examples of stormwater credits. A rain garden infiltrates 50,000 cubic feet of water per year, and it receives a credit of 50,000 cubic feet in terms of volume control. A lot of watershed organizations have volume control requirements, for example. The rain garden results in the removal of 10 pounds of phosphorus, and the credit here, of course, is 10 pounds of phosphorus. That could be, and that's generally going to be on an annual basis. You have 3 rain gardens that remove 10 pounds. And you can take credit for all 3 of those, resulting in a reduction of 30 pounds. And Anna's going to talk a little bit about some of that, I think, in terms of reporting on TMDLs. So how are credits used? They can be used to meet the construction stormwater permit requirement of 1-inch volume control. They can be used to meet the MIDS performance goals, 1.1 inch, for example. They can be used to meet TMDLs, total maximum daily load requirements. They can be used to meet an annual phosphorus reduction of 60%. These are just examples. Some of you maybe have other examples or requirements. And why are they important? Because they're used to meet regulatory requirements. That's obviously important to permittees. But on a bigger picture scale, we use this crediting process to help us meet water restoration and protection goals. And the reason we use them for stormwater is unlike something like wastewater or industrial discharge, where you have a single pipe that we can simply go out and monitor to see what's coming out of that pipe. With stormwater, we have dozens, hundreds of pipes and conveyance systems and catch basins, and it's simply not feasible to go out and monitor all of these. So what we do is based on, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here, based on research and other information that we gather, we determine that a particular stormwater management practice is going to perform at a certain level, and that is the credit that's given. So is crediting a black box? And I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this session today, is to try to get an understanding of your understanding of stormwater crediting. And do we simply make up these numbers, or how rigorous are the numbers? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So there's a little bit of history here. So in 2005, when the manual was first put together, credits were based on available monitoring data. Those were revised in 2008. And I came on board about that time and started working on this issue. The MIDS, the Minimal Impact Design Standards work groups, were operational between roughly 2010, 2012. And those groups formed technical teams around best management practices, for example, and went back and looked at some of the credits and revised them, assigned credits to new practices such as green roofs and iron enhanced sand filters. And since the MIDS work group went away in about roughly 2013 to present, it's largely may seem like a bit of a black box to folks. Internally here, we look at numbers and we come up with numbers, and we try to get that information out. And those numbers are hopefully based on good information that we get from research and monitoring. Typically, we'll do fairly rigorous literature reviews. We'll have direct communication when it's necessary to do so. It's initiated generally by us internally. We do look at these numbers when we see new research coming out that suggests, well, we're giving a credit that's too high or too low. We'll take a look at that number and adjust them. We don't do that lightly. We know that you use these numbers, and it's not a good thing to give an 80% credit to a BMP and all of a sudden after 10 years say, well, it should be 70 or 60% instead. So what's the crediting process going to look like beyond? And I think that's one of the goals of this session, is to help us evaluate, is the credit process right now okay? Does it need some tweaking, or does it need a major overhaul? Just a couple examples. So if we look at a wet swale, initially we were giving a TSS removal of 68%. The International BMP database has gradually gotten more and more rigorous over time, and now it's a very good resource of information. We go into the International BMP database and we find a wetland channel, which is a closest BMP to a wet swale, and we see that that 68% number is too high, and so we dropped it down to 35%. Iron enhanced sand filter would be an opposite example. where initially during the MIDS process, we just didn't have enough data. We didn't have enough of these practices on the ground. And so we knew in the laboratory we're seeing 80, 90% in some cases removal of dissolved phosphorus, but we just didn't have the data to support that number. So we went with 40%. In 2020, we adjusted that and went to a tiered approach because now we were starting to get some better data, and you can now get up to 60% credit if you implement certain design, construction, and O&M practices. And this was based on input formed over the last 5 years or so. We've met a few times. We talked to these folks. They give us information, obviously better information coming out from these practices and from the University of Minnesota researchers. Unfortunately, we still lack really solid data. So we hope that at some point in the future, we might be able to get up to something like 70, 80% credit for this practice, but we just don't feel we have the data to support it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not a good practice for us to give a high credit and then back off on that credit later. So at this point, I'm just going to stop for just a second before I go into an example with the MIDS calculator and see if there are any questions. I'll stop sharing for just a second here. Does anybody have any questions about crediting and the process of crediting at this point? Okay. I will go back, but feel free to jump in. I think Carly mentioned this is, we want to keep these informal. If you have questions, clarifications, whatever, please feel free to jump in or put a question in the chat box. And I believe Carly's probably monitoring that. Is this where we do the poll questions, Carly?
Yeah, I can bring those up.
Okay, before we go into the examples.
Yeah. All right, for everybody that joined a little later, I just reposted the Mentimeter survey link into the chat. So if you want to click on that, it'll bring you up to the questions here. All right, so looks like some of you guys have already answered this one. But this question, when determining values to use for pollutant removal, which of the following is true? Check all that apply. It looks like someone selected other. Do you think you could possibly comment in the chat what you use? And again, Mentimeter is anonymous, so this is just giving us an idea of where people are at and what they're using when they're calculating pollutant removal. All right, I'm going to give it another second here. Again, I did post the Mentimeter survey link into the chat, so just click on that and it'll bring you right up to the Mentimeter survey. All right, well, it looks like majority of the folks that have answered this question are using models, the PCA simple estimator, MIDS calculator, P8, etc., things like that. Next question, which of the following statements is most accurate? Right, I think I'm going to give it another second here, but it kind of looks like everyone's falling into the the statement, "I know where to find this information, but is not clearly delivered from the MPCA." Moving on to the next question. Which of the following is preferred for finding out about new or modified credits? Check all that apply. So I guess this question kind of relates to the previous question, just how you would like to receive that information. And then if you are, selecting the other category, can you please comment in the chat what form of communication you would like to see from MPCA? That would be helpful. All right, I'm going to give it another second here, but it looks like email or posted in the Stormwater manual are the two most popular answers. All right, next question. Which of the following statements is most accurate? All right, I'll give this another second or so. I know these responses probably took a little bit more to read and decide which one you identify with the most accurately. All right, kind of looks like we have folks all across the board on this one. All right, and Mike, I will give it the presentation back to you. Thanks everyone for answering the questions.
Thanks, Carly. I'm going to go back to sharing here. So you can hopefully hear me and see my PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to talk about two broad examples, case studies here, meeting the MIDS performance goal using the MIDS calculator. I'll talk about that, and then I'll pass it over to Anna, and she'll talk about meeting TMDL requirements. And then she's also going to briefly show where we have credit information in the Stormwater Manual Wiki, although based on input from this presentation too, we may go back and tweak that a little bit. It just occurred to me now, and this was not a Mentimeter question, and it really wasn't meant to be, but we used to do training on both of these in person at the PCA, and then of course COVID came along, and we have done a couple sessions remotely, and frankly those have been a little bit rough. It's and we've kind of shied away from them, but certainly feel free in the chat box, or you can send me an email or whatever. But if you think that you would be interested in any of these training sessions for the calculator or the estimator, we would like to know that. And also whether or not you'd be comfortable with in-person, which I think was much more productive when we were doing those in-person trainings. So anyways, with that, I'll move on to the MIDS calculator example. So the MIDS calculator was designed primarily to meet volume requirements. And if you met the rationale being that if you met your volume requirements, you were going to meet your pollution removal targets as well. So I'm going to go through a few examples here about using the MIDS calculator. It's not always meant to be, it's not always used to meet just the MIDS performance goal. We've seen it used for a variety of other purposes. The construction water, stormwater permit, for example, that 1 inch requirement. Then, of course, there are the MIDS performance goals themselves, which can vary depending on the type of project, whether it's linear or nonlinear. MIDS performance goals for sites with restrictions. In other words, if you can't infiltrate the full 1.1 inches, what do you do? And then we're going to take a brief look at meeting annual performance goals. So the MIDS calculator was designed to look at meeting a 1.1 inch event, and a lot of crediting requirements are based on annual reductions, for example, TMDLs. So how do those relate to each other? So if looking at the MIDS calculator, and let's just say we have to meet a 1 inch requirement because we have a construction stormwater permit, you would go in and you would answer yes to the compliance question. Hopefully you can see my mouse. So you would say yes to this compliance question, and the reason is that there is a BMP in there that does not meet the instantaneous volume requirement in the permit, and so that gets shut off if you have to meet a construction permit. You would change the default value from 1.1 to 1 inch. You do not need to enter soils information, and annual rainfall is irrelevant. And the reason is that we're only capturing water off of the impervious surfaces. And so it's only rainfall that falls on the impervious surface and is assumed to be routed to whatever stormwater practices you're putting in. So we're not looking at any runoff from pervious surfaces, and the rainfall doesn't matter because we're trying to capture 1.1 inch. And so your volume requirement is 3630 cubic feet. If we bump that up to the MIDS goal of 1.1, everything is the same, except that now we flip back to no for the permit because we no longer need to meet that construction stormwater permit. We use the default value of 1.1, and our volume requirement jumps up to 3993 because we have that extra 1/10 of an inch. But again, it's not soils information, annual rainfall are not relevant because we're only looking at the impervious surface. Again, if you have a nonlinear site with restrictions, or there's some other requirement that kicks in, it's the same process as the previous slide. The only thing you need to do is just change this retention requirement to match whatever it is. If you have a retention requirement of 1/100th of an inch, that's what you would put in here. But the only thing that's going to change then is, well, what's my volume requirement that I need to meet at the site? This changes if you need to meet an annual performance goal, because now we're looking at runoff from pervious surfaces, and we're looking at differences in annual runoff from one site to the other based on the rainfall that occurs at that area. So the zip code now becomes important because that zip code is tied to annual rainfall. Obviously, you're going to get more rain in southeast Minnesota than you are in west central Minnesota. And then you need to enter your soils information because now we're getting some runoff from pervious surfaces. And I'll show a graph in a minute about why that's important. And so your volume requirement is going to vary based on these two inputs. And actually, I'm going to drop back. Actually, if you're strictly interested in the annual volume, you don't even need to look at this performance goal requirement here because it's irrelevant. So this just illustrates the importance of soils and the size of the pervious surface that's contributing. You can see that for A soils here, that if we go from a 1 acre to a 10 acre development, where we have 1 acre pervious, 10 acres of pervious, and 1 acre of impervious, that our annual runoff increases, and our BMP is only treating what's coming off that impervious surface, so we're losing about 5% on an annual basis volume-wise. If you look at a C soil, that difference is pretty dramatic. We're looking at a 34% difference. And obviously that's because you're getting much more runoff off of sea soils, the pervious portions of sea soils, than you are off of A soils. So the credit that you're looking at really is important on an annual basis. It's important to put this information in. So what is a MIDS calculator? I mean, just a quick overview. What is it good at? What is it not so good at? The percent pollutant removals are fixed. You can't go in and you can't change how effective a bioretention practice is. And we have found that obviously is not true in reality. So just keep that in mind, that you cannot adjust that number. If you're a really savvy modeler, you can probably trick the MIDS calculator into getting what the output that you want, or the functionality that you want. Another deficiency, the phosphorus is particulate. We found that that's probably true in residential areas. If you're in industrial, commercial areas, it actually is probably closer to 70-75% particulate. So the MIDS calculator in those scenarios is actually underestimating pollutant removal. The volume calculations are fixed. What goes on behind the scenes, they're fixed. You can't really adjust the volume removal of a practice. You can change the default phosphorus and TSS concentrations. The problem is that if you have multiple land uses, well, do you have to model each of those land uses separately? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably yes. You could maybe try to come up with a single EMC that represents a mixed land use settings, but that becomes a little bit risky. You can does have evapotranspiration credits, and that's a good thing. We've updated the interception credit recently, and that's gone upwards, so you get a better credit now than you used to. And we have limited guidance right now on how to use the other BMP in the MIDS calculator. So overall, the MIDS calculator is good for determining volume credits. That's what it was designed for. If you're starting to look at using the MIDS calculator strictly for pollutant removal, it's got some deficiencies. It's okay if you're implementing infiltration BMPs because you're getting 100% removal. It's not so good for the other best management practices. And maybe that's where, if folks want to continue to use the MIDS calculator for pollutant calculations, that maybe some training or some videos on in the wiki or something along those lines might be helpful. So before I turn it over to Anna, are there any questions on the MIDS calculator? Oh, Anna says her computer just crashed. So maybe we should give her a second to hopefully get back online.
Well, meanwhile, Mike, Joe asked a question here. I don't know if you see it in the chat, but it says, be nice to get a list of all credits. And this does not have anything, I don't have to do with the MIDS calculator specifically, but he's suggesting it would be nice to get a list of all credits, when they were last updated, and the data used for the updates. Do we have a repository for any of that kind of information?
The short answer is and I can see the value in doing that. Part of the reason for this session, and I probably shouldn't say this, and maybe Brandon will give me a pink slip after saying this, was I approached Scott Fox, and then eventually you, Dwayne, and Brandon, my supervisor, and said, you know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable because a lot of the crediting stuff kind of goes through me. And I really don't know if that's, do people trust me? Should we have a more outward facing process? And frankly, compiling that information would take a little bit of time, and it hasn't been a priority. And so with Joe asking that question, maybe it's something that I bump up on my to-do list, and certainly we can compile that information So that's a long-winded answer, and the short answer is no, we don't really have that listing the way Joe mentioned it, and I can see the value in doing that.
I think I could see the value also, definitely. And so, Joe, we appreciate you bringing that up. It certainly gives us something to think about. We are always in program improvement mode, constantly, continuous improvement. And so we appreciate these thoughts, and it's something that we will certainly keep on our radar and try to incorporate that as best we can. Other than that, feel free, anyone, to just unmute and ask a question if you have any. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I do see another one. Justin, are there any prospective additions to BMPs which are given a credit?
So some of the things we're working on right now are iron enhanced sand filters. The university, we hope the university will be able to do some additional research on them and do some actual monitoring. Like I said, we really think that iron enhanced sand filters, when they're properly designed, constructed, and maintained, do a good job of removing dissolved phosphorus. I personally have been very aggressive in the past year or two for going after dissolved phosphorus. I think it was overlooked for way too long. And so the iron enhanced sand filter credit is one that I think we're really got a bullseye on, as well as street sweeping. We've now developed credits for street sweeping, and we're going to continue to work pretty hard on getting that information out. We're working with the University of Minnesota Extension folks, John Bellata, Maggie Karshnia, to develop some training outreach workshops around street sweeping credits, because manufactured treatment devices, these are proprietary underground practices. We just got some credits out for those. We might be tweaking them a little bit, but those are new credits that are out there. And ponds, we were not taking a real hard look at them, but we're starting to look at them a little bit because there's been some recent information and possibly some prospective work on ponds. Frankly, and I hate to say this, but I think our pond credits are a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit on the high side. So I think we're going to probably go back and take a look at ponds at some point down the road here.
It seems like there's quite a bit of there's a lot of things going on related to ponds. We know that there's some phosphorus issues, and I have heard, I'm no expert, but I've heard they're trying out some. And have you heard of this mining slag as a potential phosphorus reducing addition to a pond?
Yeah, we're seeing some research. Greg Wilson from Bar Engineering was recently had some research on adding alum to ponds. No, spent lime. I'm sorry, spent lime. I can't remember who, but there was a study out there looking at alum addition to ponds. That may ultimately be an important. So I think with ponds, we really want to cut down the organic loading, and street sweeping upstream of the ponds would be a really good practice for doing that. And then in the pond itself, I think we're going to see more of that in pond type of work. That's just all conjecture on my part, but that's kind of what I'm seeing right now in terms of trends.
Okay, Noah Check has submitted a question. Is there any work being done or work planned to give credits to underground detention systems?
So I'm not exactly sure what these types of practices are. So Noah, if I don't answer your question, please feel free to jump in. Obviously, if it removes pollutant or volume by itself, it's going to get credit for that. And we are going to look at underground sand filters a little bit harder, hopefully in the future, because we've heard some not so positive stories about how they're being maintained. One thing that I am seeing, starting to see in the research, is new designs for green infrastructure practices designed to address more moderate and extreme rain events. And historically, we've looked at green infrastructure and said, well, it'll take a little bit of the edge off of these moderate and extreme events, but it can't really solve the problem. I'm starting to see some designs, research modifications that involve underground detention, where you basically hold the water back and then you bleed it out to the green infrastructure. And so I think that's an area we're going to start to see a lot of work done in the future, because obviously climate is really becoming an important issue and green infrastructure is an important issue. So I think we're going to see more of these combination gray green infrastructure treatment practices, strategies put in place over the next 5 years, 10 years. Hopefully that answers your question, Noel. Is
Excellent.
maintenance, I see one more, if it's okay for me to take that one.
Yes.
Is maintenance related to credit values? Indirectly, yes. We always assume that the practice is properly maintained, and so the credit is always linked to that standard language. If properly designed, constructed, and maintained, here's the credit that you get. And of course, we've found over the years that maintenance is a pretty big deal. And so for the newer practices like iron enhanced sand filters, and maybe some of the manufactured treatment device credits that are coming, we're actually starting to link credits to maintenance that you do on these. It's not true for the old practices, the ones that were kind of in place way back in the 2000s, the ponds and that. We just assumed you were doing the maintenance. But now, for example, you can only get that 60% credit for iron enhanced sand filter if you do certain maintenance practices. So I think you're going to see more of that in the future. And hopefully that answers your question too, Joe.
Okay, Anna.
Hi, that was super exciting. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing that? Let me get my other screen set back up so I can see the chat. Okay. Okay, all right. Hi, I'm Anna Bush. I'm the Stormwater TMDL liaison, and we have reached the TMDL portion of the program today. So most of you have probably seen some version of this slide before, but I'll do a quick recap so everyone's on the same page. So total maximum daily load is two things. It's both an equation and a report. It's that TMDL requirement is triggered once a water body has been found to not meet the water quality standard, which means it's impaired or polluted. And it can be polluted for one thing or many things. So you see the list here, you know, chloride, nutrients, sediment, bacteria. So once a water body is found to be impaired, then we, in cooperation with local governments and sometimes consultants, we develop a total maximum daily load equation and report. So, and basically a TMDL is pollutants are coming from, and then a recipe for how much pollution can go into that water body and still meet the water quality standard. So if, for example, the pollutant is nutrients, then we write the TMDL for phosphorus and we'll say the total maximum daily load. So the total amount of phosphorus that can go into this water body on a daily basis is so many pounds, and it can still meet the water quality standard. So once it's submitted to EPA and is approved, then it triggers the MS4 permit requirements, which is why you all care about it. So going back to the slide that Mike showed, we're going to talk about it in terms of a pollutant reduction being achieved toward meeting a water quality goal. We don't write TMDLs for volumes. Usually it's for a pollutant. So we're talking about pollutant reductions. And then, so I'll talk about the TMDL tie-in, and then we'll go through a simple estimator example to show you how to calculate a reduction. So there's different ways to talk about the pollutant reductions. So during the application process for the 2020 permit, we talked about percent reductions, pounds of pollutants reduced, pounds per acre per year. And then in past annual reporting, it's been categorized as pounds reduced, kilograms reduced, percent load reductions, pounds per acre reduced, kilograms per hectare reduced, and then just general loads in pounds or kilograms. So in terms of TMDL reporting, there's a few different ways to count the credits. So the first, or buckets or categories. So the first category is what Mike was talking about when you have actual pollutant reductions. You can calculate a number. So that's category 1. Category 2 is things without easily quantifiable reductions. So in that case, we count the BMPs as a bean. So, you know, outreach and education, storm drain stenciling, something where you can't quantify. It's reducing pollutants in some manner, but you can't really count it. And then category 3 is the BMP either isn't implemented or it doesn't reduce pollutants. So maybe it's a feasibility study or you've acquired funding. So you're making progress, but you're not actually reducing pollutants. And that's, you don't get any beans for those for category 3. So I presented a version of this in we had a TMDL annual reporting session for the 2013 permit at the beginning of May. So I presented a version of this. I modified it because I want to keep this sort of high level, and I'm going to components. But this is a schematic of how credits can be thought of in relation to TMDLs. So you can look at it as either quantitative or as a bean. They're both credits when it comes to TMDL reporting. So first question is, you know, does your BMP or activity reduce pollutants? So that's that category 3 we're talking about. If it doesn't reduce pollutants, you know, it's a feasibility study or funding or whatever, then it's no bean, no credit. If it does reduce pollutants, then you come over to this side and can you quantify it? So can you figure out a number, a pounds reduced somehow? If you can't, then you just take credit as a bean. If you can, then we have to think about where it is. So is it located in your regulated jurisdiction? If it's not, well, were you involved in implementing it? If you weren't, then I don't know why we're talking about it. You don't get credit. If it's not in your jurisdiction, but you were involved, then you take credit as a bean. So let's go back up to this branch. So it is located in your jurisdiction. Was it operational in the last year? If not, no credit. If it was, then we get down to specific pollutants. And this is one of the difference between the 2013 permit and the 2020 permit. Under the 2013 permit, you're expected to calculate quantitative pollutant reduction credits for bacteria and chloride. We don't. Now those BMPs under the 2020 permit would be counted as beans. But so depending on which permit we're operating under, for example, under the 2020, if it's total suspended solids or total phosphorus and you can count it, then you get your quantitative pollutant reduction credit, you know, your pounds reduced or percent reduction. Otherwise, you just take credit as a bean. So the other thing we have to consider when talking about BMP crediting for TMDLs is there's another geographic component beyond just jurisdictional boundaries. So in this example, we've got some impaired waters and we have 3 cities. The city boundaries are the green lines. And you can see, so if we look at, say, Lake 2 specifically, the thing about it, TMDLs is that they don't just stick to city boundaries. They have these TMDL subwatersheds or study areas that is supposed to encompass all of the land draining to the impaired water. So for Lake 2, even though it does cross the boundary between City A and City C, the TMDL boundary reaches into City B as well. So when these cities are thinking about their credits, if we looked at this little infiltrator up here that's within City A's jurisdiction. Let's say that City B helped pay for it. They wanted to go in on it. So they would take credit as a bean because they helped, but it's not in their jurisdiction. City A would take the actual quantitative reduction. Let's see, I want to make sure I talked about it. All right. So just another layer of complexity, which, you know, is why there's lots of questions about this. So if you have, I'll stop now and take some questions, but if you have specific questions about reporting for TMDLs under the 2013 permit, like I said, we did a session on that at the beginning of May, and I'll put the link in the chat for where you can find that. It has both the video and the PowerPoint from last month, but I'll stop and see if anybody has any initial questions before we get into the simple estimator example.
Anna, regarding the flow chart that you just talked through, is that readily available for folks to look at?
It will be after I post it on our webinar page. But right now, I don't think it's out there anywhere, other than it was in the PowerPoint from last month's presentation too, but a more specific version for annual reporting.
And then Joe has a question here.
About a bean. So the way, oh, whoops, I guess that's not going to work. Hold on. Let me go back. Okay. So just a way to think about crediting is that it's sort of a bean counting exercise. So category 1 is you have an actual number. You can quantify it, calculate a load reduction. Category 2 is where I consider them as a bean. You record your activity and you get a thumbs up because you did something, but we can't. Pollutant reduction either can't be calculated or it's not attributable to your MS4 because it's either in somebody else's jurisdiction or something like that. So, or category 3, there's no bean because it's a thing, but it's not reducing pollutants. Does that help?
And if I could just interject real quick, a good example of a Cat 2 would be an outreach and education program.
Right. Yep.
We think it does good, but we don't know how good.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So yes, it's a credit without a numerical value. Exactly. Sorry, I was trying to make it easier and sometimes it doesn't quite work. Any other questions before we get into the simple estimator section?
Well, and I might add, I guess from my perspective, the bottom line standard in the MS4 permit is making progress towards achieving waste load allocations, and that comes in many different flavors. Of course, the best progress would be the stuff that we can calculate, the quantifiable BMPs. Public education programs and storm drain stenciling, that's all good too. We know that we're probably getting reductions, but they're very hard to calculate. And then Cat 3 does also count as progress, which is an expectation that we have. We want to see those on annual reports, and we want to see that in compliance schedules when those are submitted for application for permit coverage. And
right.
So if you're going to go after money and you're going to put together proposals, maybe you're going to apply for some grants to put in some BMPs later down the road, or you're going to do some feasibility studies. Those are all good things, and that constitutes making progress towards achieving your waste load allocation, and that should be reported. So we'd like to see that. There's good beans, better beans, and best beans, kind of.
All right, and I did have a question that has come up related to watershed districts. So if you have a BMP that's owned and operated by a watershed district but discharges directly to a permitted city MS4, who takes the credit? So both permittees get the credit, but only one permittee takes the load reduction credit. Some of the considerations you need to figure out is if the watershed district actually has a waste load allocation, or, you know, a portion of that total maximum daily load recipe, because they don't always have a waste load allocation. So in that case, the city would want to take the quantitative reduction, the actual number, on their report. They would say it's owned by, you know, the watershed district, but they would be taking the credit if the watershed district doesn't have an actual waste load allocation, which does happen for one reason or another. But if you have other questions, it can be TMDL specific, which is the other sort of overarching thing here, is that every TMDL was done differently. So you have to look at your specific, what you have specific waste load allocations for and how they derived some of those recipes. All right, moving on to the simple estimator. Okay, so the simple estimator estimates annual runoff and pollutant loading using the simple method. It's set up as a spreadsheet that you can enter values into, and we'll walk through an example. But so the estimator includes 9 BMP types and then the ability to add in a user-defined BMP. Being a simple estimator, it does have limitations. So within a given subwatershed, it can't model routing between BMPs or pollutant removal through BMP in a series, so like a treatment train. It can't identify or distinguish unique removal rates for individual BMPs that if they're undersized or don't meet BMP design criteria. If it's a BMP with a specific design that decreases or improves pollutant removal, like an iron enhanced treatment, or it's dealing with runoff and pollutants from an undersized BMP. So the moral of the story is that it will estimate pollutant removal from a correctly sized and designed practice that is standalone. However, there is a lot of guidance in the manual that can walk you through how to deal with treatment trains. So you can manipulate the values to deal with these situations, but it's not set up to do it automatically. And I will estimator right now. Okay, so our example. So here's our sample, our subwatershed. It's actually made up of 3 this is A, B, and C. We're only going to look at A in the consideration of time. So the steps are, we enter the land uses, calculate any adjusted loads, and then enter our structural best management practices. So if you, like I said, we're only going to do the one subwatershed. If you want to see how to deal with the other 2, it's all in the guidance and example page. So subwatershed A, the thing I want to point out before we look at the actual simple estimator worksheet is that it has residential area that's been split up between high tree canopy coverage and low tree canopy coverage. So the estimator does give you the ability to add in different land uses. So this is section 1 where we put in our areas. So this is primarily the data we're entering right now. The gray boxes are things that you cannot change. If it's yellow, there are predetermined values that you can adjust. And then the red is you can't do anything to that. That's the outputs. So if you look here, our residential, normally the EMC for residential is 0.325. We adjusted it up to 0.35 because of the high tree canopy. If you have a more tree canopy, then you have higher phosphorus runoff. So it gives us an alert because we changed that value, and then we recommend that whenever you make any adjustments in the estimator, you make a note, because if you're anything like me, the day after you do it, or maybe the hour after you do it, you can't remember it anymore. So it's best to write it down. So we changed that EMC, and then we added in our other land use, the low canopy residential, and we gave that an EMC of 0.275 instead of the standard 0.325. Okay, so we've done our first step, which was enter the land uses for this subwatershed. The next step is to calculate adjusted loads. So that's for practices that aren't structural, but they do reduce pollutants. So in this example, there was some enhanced street sweeping around the lake in subwatershed A, and then a rooftop and parking lot disconnection. So in the area that had, in the residential area that had the high tree canopy coverage, an enhanced street sweeping program was implemented. This consisted of street sweeping at the time of fall leaf drop rather than the once a fall sweeping program previously implemented. So they did measurements of the street sweeping material collected during that time, indicated that the effort reduced annual loading by about 17%. So the estimator doesn't let you just make direct changes in loading. So instead we adjusted the EMC downward. So previously this was we had adjusted it to 0.35 to account for the higher canopy. Now we're going to adjust it down to 0.3 because that resulted in a 17% reduction in loading. So you put in that reduced phosphorus EMC, kicks out a reduced annual load of almost 19 pounds. And again, we get an alert when we changed a value, and then we put in this note to remind us that we changed it because of the street sweeping program. And this is in section 2 on the estimator worksheet. The other adjustment we made in here was for the in the commercial area, there was the rooftop and parking lot disconnection. So runoff from these areas were diverted to pervious surfaces. Runoff coefficient was then adjusted from 0.71 down to 0.5 based on the calculated decrease in connected impervious surface. And that kicks out a reduction of almost 22 pounds of phosphorus. And again, we put in a note saying this was our disconnection, and then that alert is automatic because we changed that value in the runoff coefficient. Oh, and the I forgot to mention this in the section 1 section. This annual precipitation is an automatic value. Here, let me go back to that actually. So this automatically is filled in with the Minneapolis and St. Paul annual precipitation. But if you click that link, it'll take you to the US climate data or whatever. And if you're in outstate, you can look up your city's value and put in your annual precipitation, because this can vary quite a bit, like Mike mentioned previously. All right, so we did our adjusted load, so that's in section 2. Our next step is to add in our structural BMPs. So in subwatershed A, we've got our biofiltration. So we've got a bunch of rain gardens, and we have some constructed ponds. And then it's not shown on this image, but along the transportation corridor, we have some swales. So how do we put those in? So this is in section 3. We're looking at the phosphorus load reductions. We didn't do TSS in this section. If we did, that would go in section 4. So we, in the multi-use land use, 450 acres drains to constructed ponds. So we put 450 there, and keep in mind that's not the entire multi-use area. It's just what's runoff is going to those ponds, and you can't put in a value higher than your overall land use. So you can't treat more than you have, which is good fail safe. And then there's also 400 acres of the residential low canopy is going to the wet ponds. So we put those two values in. These are automatic, which can be, or automatic values that can be adjusted if needed. And it gives you total pounds reduced for that practice and a percent load reduced for that practice. We have in our transportation land use, 75 acres is being treated by swales. So we put that in, gives us our reductions. And in the residential high canopy area, we've got our rain gardens. 100 acres is being treated by rain gardens, and that gives us our reduction down here. So that's, you put those in section 3. Now we can look at overall. There's a summary sheet. So this summary sheet is showing all 3 of the subwatersheds. So you can look at each one individually. It gives you your initial loads, your final loads for each subwatershed individually, and then it adds them all up cumulatively. Your reductions per subwatershed and cumulatively, reduction percentage and pounds, and then initial and final loading rates. And then down here, there's also a loading summary of load reductions by the BMPs. So, oh, okay. Are there any questions about the simple estimator? Otherwise, I will show where to look at some things in the wiki. And then we can also have other questions after that too. Oh, I guess I better go before everybody leaves. Okay. So this is some places to find information on credits in the Stormwater Wiki. So let's talk about how to get here and what you're going to find when you do. So if you don't Minnesota Stormwater Manual credits. Let's try that. Where does that get us if we're just in Google somewhere? Overview of stormwater credits. So now we're going to get into the manual. So this is basically Mike's PowerPoint. So that's great. Thanks. But now, reminder, once you're in the manual, you can use the search box to get anywhere you want. So let's go to stormwater pollutant. That's what I wanted. Oh, what did I do? Oh, I spelled it wrong. That doesn't help. There we go. Stormwater pollutant removal. So this is sort of the overview page, and I would recommend if you find a page like bookmark it so you can find it again. So this is sort of the overview page, which is a helpful page to have. This one gives us some of the table of the different median pollutant removal percentages for several BMPs. And again, a reminder, anytime you're in the manual, I highly recommend using the page content, because then if you do have a big page, you can jump down to it. Oops, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, the specific, wanted to make sure I showed you the actual specific BMPs. So if you go, each of these are set up in the same sort of format. So let's click on bioretention. Each one of them has a PDF, a downloadable PDF, because as you can see, this is a long page with lots of information. So if it's too overwhelming to have it all scrolling, you can download the PDF and have it as a document. There's also a page video summary on each one of these, just a quick overview of what's on here. And again, if you do want to stay on the page, use the page content to help you jump around to get through all the content to help you find things. Let's see. So this, we also have updates to credits and pollutant removal values on another page. Let me go back to the main one. updates, credits, and pollutant removal. So again, I would highly recommend bookmarking this one if you're interested in how these credits work, and you'll find all the things you want. I also wanted to show you simple estimator guidance. If you're in the wiki, you can also Google simple estimator from external, and I'm sure it'll show up here. So guidance and examples, good place. This is the where you can actually download the, well, you can download it on both of the pages, but this is the page that has the example I ran through today. Again, let's see, this is where you can find those tips for addressing the different issues you might run into. Treatment trains, EMC, adjusting EMCs, adjusting the pollutant removal fractions, etc., etc. Okay, so I think that's all I've got. So we can jump back to questions. All right. If you have a categorical TMDL jointly applicable to cities and watershed districts, can everyone submit identical reports to obtain credits, or does one entity, for example, the watershed district, apply for category 1 credits and everyone else gets cat 2 credits? Yes. I would go with this. Unless, so okay. I'm assuming you're talking under the 2020 permit. And if there's an aggregator issue, we might have to discuss it further. Under the 2013, I would do the second one where everyone applies, or the watershed district gets the category 1 credits and everyone else gets category 2. If it's under the 2020, we're still developing that report, so.
We try to avoid double counting as much as
Correct. That is the. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will kick it back over. Oh, wait, what's this? New messages. Okay. So category 2 and 3 BMPs only get us so far with a TMDL. Their value is to show progress while we plan and implement category 1 BMPs. At some point, we're going to need to use only quantifiable reductions to meet the TMDL. Yes. In order to show that
and to ultimately restore the impaired water. That only happens through actual reductions, right?
Yep.
So the Cat 3s and the Cat 2s are all steps to get to Cat 1s. That's kind of the hope.
any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself also. Otherwise, I think I can kick it back over to you, Dwayne, to wrap it up.
Okay, or at least while people are contemplating maybe some additional questions, I'd like to just take an opportunity to talk about the future of our outreach sessions here that we've been putting on for the last 9 months. So it has been 9 months. We've done 9 consecutive outreach sessions, and we've been doing a lot of contemplating of what the future should look like, certainly based on some feedback that we've asked for through some of these Mentimeter surveys in some of our sessions about future needs and or what the audience would like to have in the future. And so where we have landed for now is that, so here it is in June. We believe we're going to take the month of July off, take a little hiatus for July and not have one. Folks are very busy. We've had a little drop off in attendance, and I know there's a lot of things going on in local municipalities for all municipalities in the summer. And so we're going to kind of regroup in the month of July and then resume in August and September to make it through our intended 12 monthly outreach sessions. Our thinking, what we've heard loud and clear through some of the surveys that we've done is that people really like hearing about what other MS4s are doing, either in the arena of challenges that MS4s are facing or successes that MS4s have had. Sharing notes, talking, and just sharing different experiences, human interest stories, those kinds of things. People really like that. And so we'd like to maybe gear our August outreach session towards that. And so I think Carly has a Mentimeter question. We just like to gauge your interest in using the August outreach session. We don't know exactly what the format's going to be, but it'll center around sharing experiences and sharing stories. And we thought about some breakout sessions, followed by large group session, that kind of thing. So we'd just like to get your feedback here for those of you who are still on about the August session. And while you're taking this survey right now, our September session, we are proposing to make that all about a Minnesota Stormwater Manual tour. I know many of you are very familiar with the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. Some of you aren't. I know that there's probably around half the people that attend these sessions that are between 0 and 2 years of experience in the MS4 business. Based on the survey results that we've had. And so there's a lot of folks that may not be all that familiar with the Stormwater Manual and exactly where things are and what's in it. And so we'd like to scope that down to MS4 related things in the Stormwater Manual because it's a monster. There's a lot of information in there. But this is all with the intention of helping people be able to know where things are, navigate your way to MCM1 help, MCM2 help, minimum control measure 3 help, and 4, 5, and 6 TMVLs, whatever. And just do a Minnesota Stormwater Manual tour, and that will round out our 12 monthly minus July outreach sessions. And as has always been, our intent is to do quarterly thereafter. And so the first outreach session after September would be January of 23, which would be the beginning of the quarter. And we will have another outreach session then. So that's kind of what we're thinking about the future of our outreach sessions. So I'm looking at this survey right now. It looks like clearly the majority would appreciate an outreach and sharing information, sharing stories, sharing ideas. And so maybe that's just exactly what we'll do in August. So we will take the month of July and plan that, and then see you all again in August. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that plan moving forward?
Dwayne, the only thing
Yep.
that I'll add is, sorry to interrupt, but I'll be quick here. The only thing I'll add about the manual is that even if you're familiar with the manual, we're taking a good look at it in terms of whether it needs reorganization and updating pages and stuff. So we'll try to tailor that presentation maybe into 2 segments, people who aren't familiar with the manual, and then an updates section of that presentation. Because even if you're familiar with the manual, if we do some significant reorganization in the manual, you'll probably want to at least join that portion of that session.
Thank you, Mike. So feel free to just unmute yourself and speak if you have any comments on what I just talked about. Otherwise, Anna, is there anything in the chat that you'd like to address?
Nope, I had answered. Joe had a question about, can you restore a water body just from through credits alone? And the only way that a impaired water body gets off of the impaired waters list is through monitoring that says it's meeting the standard again. So what we do on the ground actually having effects.
Noah also had a question about underground detention practices, and I put an answer in there, but the bottom line with that is if there are practices out there that do remove volume or pollutant and we are not currently giving credit for them, let us know. We'll take a look at it and see if there's enough information about that practice to warrant giving it credit.
All right, I'm just going to jump in here with the Mentimeter survey. If anybody has any last answers for the August session, I'll give it a second here, and then I'm going to move on to the wrapping up Mentimeter survey questions. Obviously, if you still have questions about today's session, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, or unmute yourself. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question here. How helpful was the information provided in this outreach session? All right, I'm going to give it another second here for everybody to answer who's left on the call. Looks like of those of you that have answered learned a couple new things, so that's always good. All right, and then if you have any other suggestions on how the MPCA can improve future outreach sessions, feel free to leave those here. This is an open-ended question and it is anonymous, so we will not know who submits the answer. All right, I think I'm going to stop sharing. So if anyone has anything, feel free to add it, and then I'll turn it back over to the presenters and Dwayne.
Okay, well, we, I believe, will sit tight for a little bit here. A couple more minutes, just in case some questions come to you. You want to ask them, we are here for you. We love questions, and this is about a discussion. And so we'll give it about 2 more minutes. Otherwise, we will shut the session down and let everybody have the rest of their day back. Okay, it looks like the session is complete. We will go ahead and shut it down. Carly, are you able to just shut it down, or do we just all leave?
I end the meeting every session.
Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and end the meeting. It looks like we are done for today.